Our guests today are Dave Meyers and Rick Reich. Dave is a partner of Troutman Pepper up in Richmond. Rich is a corporate secretary and assistant general counsel of New Jersey Resources in Wall, New Jersey. We're going to talk executive pay disclosure. I'm Brock Romanek, today on Zippy Point. So Rich, Dave, pay ratio, a very hot topic a few years ago. It's simmered down quite a bit, but there's some new things that people need to be aware of for this proxy season. But we're going to get into some of the basics for those out there who might be new to this area. And so Rich, we're going to start with you and talk about what math do you need to know or have to calculate a pay ratio?
Thank you, Brock, and thank you, Dave. So the good news is, as lawyers, we're always afraid of math, or not all of us, but many of us are. But I would say that if you went to middle school, you should be able to handle the math involved in calculating the pay ratio. You need to be able to do some median calculation and then also division. So what we need to do is determine the median employee and then also the CEO's total annual compensation, and you divide the two to come up with the pay ratio, which will always be expressed as the CEO's total compensation colon or 2 the median employee's total compensation. So for instance, if the CEO pay is $50 million and your median employee's pay is $100,000, you'd express that as 500 to 1. Dave, you can walk us through the steps of actually getting to the.
Thanks, Rich. Brock, Rich, it's great to be doing this with you both. Let me just talk a bit about the steps that we usually talk through with our clients to get to what you need to do, talking about that math. So the first is obviously, as a company, you want to try to identify the universe of your employees. And we'll talk, I think we're going to talk a little later about what employees means, but just to go through the steps. So now how do we determine our median employee? Well, you have to find a measurement date, and that has to be within the last 3 months of your last completed fiscal year. So any date within that last 3 months, and you usually try to find a date that works best based on that employee population. And so on that measurement date, that's where you're going to look at your universe of employees. And that includes, all of your full-time, part-time, and the rules also talk about seasonal and temporary employees. And from that pool, you'll use that measurement date to find the median employee. And then once you get the median employee and using that employee population, you're going to use, and we'll talk about it later, but you'll find that person using a consistently applied compensation measure. And that's usually the hardest part. And that's really where the HR and your other folks will really have to help to get that data. And then once you've identified the median employee, and that's an actual person, you will then calculate the total compensation just like you would calculate it for the CEO. And that's how you then get to that ratio that Rich just talked about. So that's sort of the steps that you go through. And later on, we'll also talk about where the disclosure goes. But that's the hardest part is obviously going to be determining that median employee through whatever compensation measure you're going to use.
Dave, just to jump in, I would say that the math is the easy part. I think kind of coming up with the methodology is where the thinking comes in, and
right.
The lawyers are usually involved.
So Dave, how do you identify who an employee is? What is that definition?
So an employee is, you're going to take, and again, I think obviously a lot of companies are international. So it's all US and non-US. It's all your full-time employees. And there are some certain exemptions to the non-US employees. I think we're going to talk about a little later, but there's part-time employees, there's seasonal employees. We have clients who have a pretty heavy seasonal workforce in, let's say, Africa, because they're in agriculture, and then temporary employees. And it's all of those people on whatever measurement date that you choose. It's that pool of people, and including all your subsidiaries, consolidated subsidiaries, as of that whatever date you choose in that 3-month period. So, and it's everybody but the CEO for that pool, because you're obviously going to do all of your your corporate people too. And so there's certain exemptions, independent contractors, leased workers, where you're not at all, an unaffiliated third party is paying for those people. They're not going to be part of that count. So, and then not to get too granular, but it gets a little bit more complicated because then you have to use a test of, defining who's part-time, who's full-time, what, who are those people in there. So I think one thing to step back about is this was very controversial when it was adopted a long time ago, this rule. What the SEC has done is built in an incredible amount of flexibility into it and reasonableness. So because of that, there's a lot of leeway into how, I think as long as you're reasonable and you're doing you're using a widely recognized test to figure out if a worker is an employee, you're explaining how you derive that. There is a lot of flexibility built in by the SEC in order to come up with that pool. But that's generally the gist of what the pool of your people is that you're looking at to figure out who the median employee is.
And then how often are you required to identify the median employee? Is there a possible need to redo it for 2021?
The pay ratio disclosure is required every year, but you only have to identify the median employee once every 3 years, unless there's a change. And again, getting granular, going into if there's a significant change to that median employee, you have to recalculate it. But it's going to be, you can use that same median employee as long as you reasonably believe that there hasn't really been a change to over the 3 years. And then there'll be another recalculation of that again after the third year, assuming that there's no change. Some companies, I will be honest, have found that it's just easy to recalculate it every year. And so I was surprised to see that. Stepping back for a second, and Rich, maybe you can talk to this, but to me, it seems like the calculation, these math that Rich was talking about, hasn't been as hard to get the data. And maybe, that's the nature of the employees that maybe my clients are. But because of that, it sometimes it's just easier to recalculate it every year. I think companies may feel more comfortable knowing that they're doing it the right way and that the median's coming up pretty much the same way. But that's the basic idea. But you can use the same one every 3 years.
Yeah, we found that the first year, I think we spent at least 6 months, if not longer, building the spreadsheet and getting it to connect to the payroll system. But it's much easier in subsequent years for us, and I think for most companies, to pull the median employee. I think if you have a situation where you acquire a large number of employees or some significant change in your workforce, it may make sense to take a new look at the median employee and not wait for the 3 years, because I think the SEC doesn't want something that's misleading, and things can change in your workforce where that median employee is no longer appropriate in a subsequent year. But and again, as Dave said, it is quite easy usually to rerun that calculation once you have that spreadsheet or whatever system you have set up for year one.
Yeah, with the pandemic, some workforces definitely are changing quite a bit. So this is definitely another factor for this season, I think.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, Brock. That's a really good point. There very well may be a lot of changes due to the pandemic now and things that have happened in compensation matters that will be unique probably for this upcoming proxy season that we might not have seen, if everything was normal. So that is a great point.
So Dave, what about the use of statistical sampling? Does that make the job easier?
Yeah, I think for very large employee workforce companies, there's a lot of there's a lot of flexibility built in, and so companies are allowed to, whatever facts and circumstances they have to determine the median employee they can employ. They can use statistical sampling. They can use other reasonable methods. They can use a combination, and so a lot of times, large companies may be a good option to use, and the SEC has given a lot of guidance on the different types of statistical sampling you can do, but as long as it's reasonable or you can combine it, that is a good way to go about figuring out. So it really cuts down on the amount of data that you have to do. So if you have a very, very large and decentralized company, a lot of times it might be that statistical sampling can reduce, that data load that has to do and make it much more efficient and less costly. So, and you can also combine statistical sampling with other reasonable methods to identify that median employee. I think we all just are trying to stress the flexibility that's built into it. They really want companies to be, I think reasonableness and flexibility is really what's built in there, and they're trying not to, enormously burden companies in order to develop this data in order to figure out who that median employee is.
And then, Rich, what about selecting a consistently applied compensation measure? That kind of methodology, what's that about?
So this is another area where the rules give us some flexibility. So the SEC is worried about the measure that you choose being consistently applied across your workforce. And this is, it could be different, and probably should be for your sanity, different than the summary compensation table calculation of total comp, which could be quite complicated. In our case, we have a pension plan that's frozen, but a lot of employees have changes in pension valuation every year. So to run that across the whole workforce would be really burdensome. So there are a lot of other options. You could use base salary. We use total annual cash compensation. You could use W-2 wages or total taxable compensation as another example. But the important thing is, regardless of which measure you choose, it just needs to be consistently applied across the company and for all the employees.
And then, Dave, what about the data privacy and de minimis exemptions that were mentioned earlier? What are those about?
So if you have a large group of international non-US employees that are located in different countries, there are two exemptions that the rules provide for. One is a data privacy exemption, and that has to do with whether it would violate the data privacy laws of a particular jurisdiction. That's a hard one to utilize because you need to get an opinion of counsel, and so you don't really see that too often. And there's a lot of disclosure that goes with that, of relief that you need to seek and stuff. So you don't usually see that, but that is an exemption. And then the other one is a 5% de minimis exemption, which I think we see a lot more often, where you can exempt non-US employees where they account for 5% or less of the total population of US and non-US employees. And so that we do see companies more utilize. The important thing is that it's a total of 5%, not 3% here, 3% there, but 5% in the aggregate. There is also a sort of an exemption, a year exemption for in business acquisitions, that also an M&A exemption that you get a year leeway to integrate that company in there. But that's pretty much the realm of different exemptions that you allow. So it's very narrow in terms of what they're allowing, although I will say that we have seen a lot of use of the 5% just because of the, if you have 3% in Tanzania, for example, it's it makes it helpful for the company to be able to exclude it.
So that's all the math. What about the actual disclosure in the proxy? Where in the proxy does that go, and what does that typically look like, Dave?
You are required to have it in the body of the proxy statement. It can't be in an appendix or an exhibit. Again, flexibility. They don't really say where to put it. It doesn't usually. We don't see it in the CD&A. We usually see it at the end of the compensation tables and narrative. So it's not required though where to go, other than, like we said, I would say a vast majority. I think when we looked, it's about 80% put it after the compensation tables in the narrative. But definitely believe it should be outside of the CD&A. You don't want to know whether or not the CD&A becomes part of the pay vote, the advisory vote, and so you'd like to keep it outside of that. And you also don't really want to have to worry about whether the comp committee, if it's in the CD&A, is voting on it and approving it beyond what their typical processes are. So that's what we normally
typically
say.
like one paragraph. Yeah.
So the interesting thing is that most of the discussion now, I would say I think the first year was a little more detailed. Now you're down to like 1 to 2 paragraphs because you're just basically giving the methodology and redisclosing and keeping it very, very tight. I would say, yeah, it's a half page of disclosure typically.
And then Rich, Dave mentioned that CD&A might not include any mention of the pay ratio. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, in my experience, the CD&A has not addressed the CEO pay ratio. And I think the principal reason for that is the pay ratio hasn't really come up in the comp committee discussions as something that the comp committee is considering when they're making executive compensation decisions. So it may not be universal across every company, but I think it's unusual to have a lot of discussion or any discussion of the CEO pay ratio in the CD&A. And particularly because it's been much less of an investor concern than we originally thought when the rules went into effect.
Yeah, I would just add, I would just agree with Rich on that. You don't see much of it, if at all, in the CD&A, and it's also, I think Rich would agree with this. It's not been an investor issue. Maybe how it was portrayed in the media of what might happen. There's really been very little discussion about it in terms of like bad publicity or things like that about it. And some companies do give different tables. They'll give maybe just U.S. employees if they think it helps them, or show it different ways, which are like I said, there's a lot of flexibility to do. But even that, I think most companies have discovered that there's not much discussion about it with investors. So it's just better to just comply with the rules and move on.
Yeah, it's hard to believe it wasn't too long ago that I had multiple day conference on pay ratio, and even a pre-conference about pay ratio. And then, like many cases, it's a whole lot about nothing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.